We'll just start recording. So no intro today.
Cool.
He needs no intro. We were just talking about
No
qualifying for
intro,
the
just
Olympics.
right to it.
That's right. Yeah, we're old friends. Um, no, have you always been at like that 6.5 minute mile pace? Like, has it been harder for you to get down into the like true speed, and that's why you didn't make a run for it for the Olympic side of it?
Yeah, it's one of those things where I probably just kind of stopped or veered off of those sort of intensities being kind of the primary
Hmm.
focus. Like the way I look at it is like race day intensity kind of guides how the preparation ends up going. So you sort of reverse engineer from there. And when you get into kind of shorter, like Olympic distance rates, that tends to be things in the moderate to high intensity versus things in the ultra marathon world, which tend to lean a little more to the easy intensity or the easy category. So it just kind of
Yeah.
skews things a little bit more from a priority standpoint. And like the most, so I guess maybe the way to describe it would be I did a pretty thorough job of like just exhausting the inputs in what I would consider like a pretty really high quality way through college. But I finished college in my early 20s and then sort of from there on started kind of drifting a little bit away from anything but the marathon for the most part. And then I found myself doing ultra marathons a lot sooner than I originally planned. So then it was kind of like I never probably filled the gap between what you would see a lot of people do post collegiate careers with what they could get to if they just kind of kept stressing those other systems more and more.
Yeah, got
Um,
it.
but I mean, even if you look at just kind of my relative development and kind of the standards I was hitting and things like that, it would have been pretty unlikely that I would have gotten any further than maybe qualifying for the trials for the marathon. And then that would have been the
Mm.
end of the road for me for sure. I don't think I would have ever gotten fast enough to be like competing at the trials in any meaningful way that would put me at the games, so to speak.
Yeah, got it. Okay. And that was just this is always a tougher thing. It's coming from like a football rugby perspective. There's always much more of an upside because it's a team sport and you can't really compare yourself relative to others. But when you're running, you know exactly where you're fitting in and you know exactly where trajectories are. You also know your body style and your muscle fiber type and things like that. So was that a big decision for you of like you just started leaning into the ultras right away as that thought process of okay, I'm probably not going to make the sprinting marathon side of it. I might as well just go for the ultra. Is that where that delineation kind of happened?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I guess like my college experience was a bit of an eye opener for me in the sense that I at that point in my running career, like I was just oblivious to like how much training some of my peers were doing in high school. So I had a little bit of catch up
Yeah.
to do just in general to get ready for kind of like what I had to do to kind of catch up with them more or less. And then I would say I spent most of my college career sort of in that spot where I was like, okay, learning what type of runner I actually was, like what inputs do I enjoy the most, what endpoints tend to yield the biggest progress for me and that sort of thing. And it's actually kind of funny because if you look at kind of my mileage that I would hit with my training programs in high school versus my peers, I was probably doing like a third to half of a lot of them. And then by the end of my
Yeah.
college career, I was one of the higher mileage guys on the team because I found out through that experience that I responded really well to volume. And it was more
Mm.
kind of specificity with speed work dosing was more a little, maybe a little more finesse versus some of my like more middle distance peers and friends that would be like, oh, I could just do a speed workout every other day and just hyper respond to it. And then they had a little bit of a
Interesting.
different trajectory. So I would say like with that, I kind of like resided in my mind at the time to like, running is something I really enjoy. I'm good enough at it. I like to be active, and I was very aware of like the removal of structures post college and post high school so that it would be kind of on me to maintain any sort of health and fitness program at that point. And since running was the thing I was the most interested in, I just kind of committed to making that a hobby as I kind of entered my teaching career at the time. And,
Yeah.
I was interested enough in it where I invested a ton of my free time. And I was probably training when you add up everything like close to 20 hours a week, a lot of times, even during the school year and stuff like that. So it was something that I really resonated in from an internal motivator. but never thought of it as being anything but that. And kind of like we were chatting a bit before, I had some like relative early success where I sort of just jumped in a marathon without really any real goal with it, and I had more or less like disbanded speed work. Because after college I was like kind of tired of speed work and I was like really interested in volume, so I went to like all right, I want to see what it's like to kind of have a training cycle where I'm hitting 100-mile training weeks. And it was probably actually good that I didn't entertain speed work during that at the time, because I was still learning a lot about running and kind of how the inputs impact training load and training adaptations, and what the do's and don'ts are essentially. And I increased my mileage without having too much stress from speed work for the most part for about a year. And then I jumped into a marathon and ran a 2:36 that came as it came as a kind of an interesting way. I kind of went out what ended up being relatively slow, like in kind of somewhere in like maybe the 6.5 to 6:15 minute mile pace, and then found midway through that was like pretty conservative and was running like mid 5:30s for a good chunk of the second half, and brought that down to, so I negative split it by a large margin. So then I was thinking to myself, well, with actually training specifically for it, pacing it a little more aggressively, what could I get down to? So I kind of played around with some of that for a little bit. I still don't think I ever really did what I would consider a really good, solid marathon training cycle. But what ended up happening was I got distracted by a 50-miler and I did the 50-miler. Yeah, yeah. And that's where I kind of had my first taste of just like, oh, I just finished at the top of the podium, like versus like, being on a strong team, but not someone who is going to like really do more than maybe score a couple points on a track and field team, or be like, just barely on varsity on the cross country team, or in high school, like making the state meets and things like that, but not hitting the podium or anything like that. So that was a little bit of a new experience for me. And I would say that, and also just like a pretty healthy curiosity and just kind of the volume side of development, put me in a position where I started kind of getting interested in ultra marathoning a little bit earlier than I had originally intended. And then that first one I did was in 2010. And by 2011, at the end of the year, I was basically all in, and I haven't really looked back at peaking for anything shorter than an ultra marathon since then. So that's kind of how I think, like, I sort of like kind of veered off of like what would be considered a good trajectory in terms of finding your true potential at some of the Olympic distances, in an effort to stress test what I could do in ultra marathoning. And I mean, as far as ultra marathoning goes, it was about as good of a decision I could probably make in terms of like building a lifestyle that I have now, because ultra running has just continued to grow, and I've been able to kind of grow with the sport for a large portion of that time frame and kind of build out a career within it, which has been a lot of fun.
Well, and a couple of world records helps that, and a few podiums here and there. kind of streamlines that process, thought process.
Yeah, and then, we're talking about the Olympics and things like that, and like people who follow the Olympics probably realize, like, the Olympics is every 4 years, but that doesn't mean these folks aren't doing stuff every year. They're also competing at world championships, national championships, and things like that. So although ultra running doesn't have a representation at the Olympics, they do have world championships for a few of their events, and one of them is the 100-kilometer distance, which I've been able to compete on Team USA 3 different times for. In 1 year, we got gold as a team, and I was second on our team, 6th in the world. So it's like those sort of experiences have been really kind of cool to kind of like add to the flavor of what is a very, like you said, individual sport, in the sense that you're kind of out there competing against yourself, your own body and mind, and you have a lot of support for sure. But really, at the end of the day, it's not like you're passing the ball to a teammate and hoping they hit the shot, or throwing the football down the field and hoping the wide receiver catches it. It's a lot of like, the buck stops at you, essentially.
Yeah, and there's a very clear delineation too. If you don't put the work in, you see it on race day, and if you put the work in, you see it on race day. Like, there's a very cause and effect kind of loop.
Yeah, there's no hiding behind LeBron James.
That's right. Yeah. Well, whether you want to call it hiding or you're just in the shadow of whatever the case may be, the large individual. Yeah. Oh, that's funny. Well, yeah, and this is kind of funny. This is the way that I was actually thinking of starting the podcast off was I'm totally fascinated by your pace at 100 miles. And I always just close my eyes and I envision, even when I was at my peak health and I was a starting tailback of a national championship game, your pace that you run 12 hours for on 100 miles is like what my sprinting was. And I can't even imagine like that thought process running through my head of just how you physically trained yourself into that level is just mystifying to me, because for me, getting that 100 yards at that pace was difficult. And then there you are doing it for 12 hours straight. So like, take me through the process of how you thought about, I mean, because obviously it just starts to happen, but how you thought about getting at that level of that speed. What was it for you that really solidified that thought of that speed for you?
Yeah, when I think about it, it's one of those things where I think I was really fortunate that I was able to kind of experience running and my growth within it through a lot of kind of what I would call like local sort of comparators. So I didn't get ahead of
Mm.
myself or get a lot of like expectations cast upon me that would like introduce things that would maybe be overwhelming at the time. So like the first mile I ever ran was like a 7.5 minute mile, the first actually like documented one. And it's like, had you told me at the time there, it's like, okay, the goal here is to run 6:47 pace, not for 1 mile, which would have probably felt like an extreme at the time for 1 mile, but for 100, I would have been maybe overwhelmed by that idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like the fact that like at that time I was competing against like a handful of classmates for the Presidential Physical Fitness Challenge and had some success there, that kind of led me towards keeping an open mind about distance running versus more traditional sports, team sports and things like that. And then like in high school, kind of not having grand expectations as to what I would get out of track and field and cross country, and then ultimately finding myself in a position where I had a shot to make the state cross country meet, and then picking that as a target. And then like with college, just like thinking, all right, I just want to try to make the team and then see what happens. And then kind of looking at that as an experience where now I'm surrounded by a lot of people who know way more than I do about running. I've got coaches who've invested their entire life essentially into training methodology and things. So I have this opportunity to really learn and grow from others there. And then eventually getting to a point where like discover ultra marathoning, and that sport was opening up a avenue for professionalism that wasn't there when I was, running my first mile or even running in high school and college for the most part. So being able to kind of like take it one step at a time versus trying to think, I guess what you could say like globally at too early of an age, has probably been a huge asset for me in terms of like really normalizing that. Once you get to kind of like the ultra running side of all that, it's just one of those things where I think for me, it was sort of a growing process of being introduced to the sport through the trails, learning kind of partway through that there's a way more diversity within the sport of ultra running than just the trails, and that flat runnable stuff is available. And, for me, someone who grew up in Wisconsin and started my career running on a lot of relatively flat roads, recognizing, training specificity and course specificity matter when you're choosing between a 400-meter track or a mountain with 20+% grade. And
Yeah.
then being able to kind of access an event that kind of matched my training environment a little bit better, and recognizing, oh, you know what, I've got more tools available to me on race day when all those things line up, and kind of catching the growth of the sport there too, was something where I think like you start kind of like hitting some paces that give you an opportunity to get close enough to another one. So for example, when I ran my first track ultra in 2013, I averaged, I think it was a 7:04 pace for 100 miles. And from there, it was like, well, the world record at the time was like 6:52, 6:53. So I'm like, well, that's not far enough off that I should be deterred by that. So then the goal was like, well, let's see if
Yeah.
I can get down to that fast. And, I had a race in there where I was on pace for that, for the majority of it, through 80 miles, in fact, and then kind of fell off a little bit at the end, and still ran my fastest 100 miler at the time and rebroke my American record for 100 miles, but fell short of the world record. But I was one step closer then. Now I had averaged 7-minute mile pace for 100 miles. So then it was like, all right, kind of keep whittling down. And then in 2019, everything kind of like lined up for me at the Pettit Center, and I ran 11:19 for 100 miles, which took about 9 minutes off the previous world record at the time. And yeah, so that's just like kind of like those experiences just led me like kind of almost one step at a time. Uh, I guess like, I didn't necessarily fall for what can be a common pitfall where you have like kind of a big growth spurt and then you expect another growth spurt right away. I definitely
Mm.
sometimes hoped for a big growth spurt right away, but didn't get it. But that didn't necessarily deter me from kind of continuing onward. So, yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. I think when I zoom out, it looks a lot more kind of like, man, there's a lot of opportunity for me to screw this up that I somehow managed to navigate. But when you
Yeah.
kind of zoom in on each individual component of it, it's like, oh yeah, I can see kind of how that worked out and how that played out. And certainly fortunate with like the timing of everything, but that tends to be the case. I think whenever you find yourself doing something that is meaningful, is there's going to be you're going to get some breaks along the way, and you're going to work hard, and there's going to be like all those components kind of coming together.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like too, you're talking about an overarching theme, which I think is super important for people, especially anyone trying to get in shape or, get healthy or any of those sorts of things, or kids who are interested in playing sports, is that your
Yeah.
mindset is very long term and you're thinking of it as incremental improvements, whereas almost everyone wants to think about it as an immediate, like, I'm going to sign up and I'm going to win kind of thought process. So I just want to point that out. And second public service announcement that maybe we can riff back and forth on is early specialization in children in sports is the not the way to go. In that you come
Yeah.
from a background where you did a multiple of a variety of things you didn't even know that people were really training hard in high school, and there you end up setting a world record, 15 years later after
Yeah.
it. It's proof that, you don't have to do the sport so intensely that in fact just being an athlete is better. So in your experience, what have you seen in that realm as far as people getting into the sport? Strategies, long-term strategies, kids, like what is the advice out there that you want to portray out into the world?
Yeah, yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I find that with ultra running, there's definitely a huge diversity of like other sports coming into ultra running and doing quite well. I think there was a stretch there where there was a handful of former lacrosse players that did quite well as ultra marathon runners. One of the guys he's got the course record at Javelina and finished in the top 10 at Western States this year, which was like pretty definitively the fastest year at Western States across kind of like the top tier of the field. He was a former baseball player. So it's like it's one of those things where I think you're right. I think
Yeah,
there's like
interesting.
there's a lot of like development that I think keeps you maybe both interested in sports to the point where when you do get to a point where you can really specialize, you haven't already sort of exhausted both the physical and energy that is going to keep that exciting for you. It's still kind of fun, and you can kind of sprinkle in the hard stuff to get you to the top or where you want to be, but not at the expense of just like kind of your physical well-being, because you sort of built a structure that's a little bit more durable from being a little more well-rounded. And I would say for me personally, I've almost learned that lesson again, where the first time I didn't learn it on purpose. I just learned it because I was super interested in sports, and my parents were pretty firm about you got to be doing something. So I was
Yeah.
signing up for every sport I could. I was very 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 welcoming of that expectation, but it was something that led me to doing basically every sport that I could have access to at the time when it was made available. And then yeah, I think that probably allowed me to maybe stay a little more durable early in my career and not find myself in a situation where I was like kind of having imbalances or developmental issues from being a little too specific. Yeah, and then as an adult, you kind of have those built-in systems removed a little bit, and you get a little bit older, and then you realize, okay, now I have to kind of like address what I was doing with a multi-sports approach through things like strength work and mobility and stuff that kind of keeps you
Yeah.
in that same space without kind of overreaching too much within the specifics of running. The interesting thing too about ultra running is it's getting to be a little bit more specialized in the sense where people kind of have to pick a specific type of thing if they really want to kind of stand out. but there is still a lot of variability, and the trails are the more popular area for ultra running. So if you're a trail runner training for, say, like one of the bigger 100 milers in the world, like Western States or Ultra Trail Mont Blanc, your training is going to be a lot more varied because of the train you're on. And then you're also likely going to do things along the way that are maybe a little more conducive to variety. So you might do some shorter races and some speed work development phases to kind of get ready for what will ultimately be a peaking phase. You get a lot of sort of like crossover between people who are doing like ski mountaineering or mountain biking and things like that, where, yeah, it's a very cardiovascular, endurance heavy kind of framework, but the actual mechanics of it all are very diverse. So you end up having like maybe a little bit more durability within the sport, and something where you change. Like I haven't done a lot of the cross training models to the large degree like some of the mountain runners have, but what I have done is if I have a long enough stretch where I'm targeting something flat and runnable, then I will say, okay, I just need a break from that physically and mentally. And then I'll train for something like a mountain race or something like that. And I think that's really
Yeah.
helped. And I find like whenever I do have hiccups, it's usually because I've stretched out training for the same thing too many times in a row. And I need to just say, all right, I need to take a step back from that in order to take a step forward in the future. And every time I've done that, it's like, oh yeah, it's also really fun to kind of switch up the training inputs and do something in the mountains versus doing something on the track or the roads or something flat.
Yeah, and I think that that's a lesson for everything. Like we all get into these little habits and these ruts that we need to break free from and get out and experience something different in order to even work harder at the thing that we're mainly doing. So that 80/20 rule. So you guys are in the mountains right now. We can talk about that. I mean, we talked a little bit pre-recording. You just did 13,000 feet in a training run, so that must have been pretty fun.
Yes, yeah. So right now, I'm also really fortunate. My wife Nicole is a competitive ultra marathon runner as well, so I don't get any backlash from long training sessions.
Yep.
In fact, it's kind of it's sort of a like, hey, well, I'm going to do it and you're going to do it, and sometimes it lines up and we can do it together. So that's always kind of a value add there. But right now, she's training for the Leadville 100,
Okay.
and that's coming up in about 2.5 weeks. So Leadville 100 is an interesting event and course. It's definitely a mountain course, and the lowest it is 10,000 feet, and then from there you climb, up to some really really high spots on the course. But it's all at altitude. So us living in Austin, and both of us living at sea level or more or less sea level our entire lives, just kind of puts us in a position where if Nicole wants to kind of really kind of maximize her potential there, getting out into some of those trails and getting up above sea level for a long enough period of time to feel comfortable in that environment is kind of the final piece to the puzzle. So we're actually out here in Taos, New Mexico right now for about a week kind of training out in the mountains there, and then we'll go to Telluride for a couple of weeks before the race, and yeah, spend a few weeks at 10,000 plus feet and get all the up and down you can tolerate.
Yeah, what an experience. So, how do you guys coordinate? Is it one time a year that you guys do a big coordinating planning session to try to figure out? Because obviously you've got long thought processes. Um,
Mhm.
what does family planning look like for you guys?
Yeah, you know what it usually comes down to is we'll at the beginning of the year, we'll at the very least kind of carve out what we want to peak for the first half of the year,
Hmm.
and then sort of plan accordingly for that. And then sometimes depending on kind of how the year is set up, we'll plan the whole year and get kind of dialed in with what we need to do in order to make that work. And it usually works just fine for a lot of the reasons I just said, because like if I pick like that, let's say it's a year where I'm just like all in on flat runnable stuff, it still benefits me to get out of that for a little bit of time. I'm still going to have like off seasons or deload weeks and things like that, or transitions in what my training focus is. So if I'm like planning far enough ahead, I can kind of account for that. So for like this particular one, I knew Nicole was going to be doing Leadville since the beginning of the year. So I sort of set up my year in a way where I would do a race in June, take a little bit of downtime after that, do a speed work development phase, or begin one anyway, for about 4 weeks, and then like have another 3 week stretch where we're going to be in the mountains and in the terrain that she's going to be racing on. And my thought was at that point, I would benefit from a little bit more variety and variability on the trails and things like that for a period of time before kind of jumping back into like a full on speed work development stretch again or training block. So yeah, some of it is just kind of like looking at what are the balancing what balance of different inputs do you want in order to put yourself in the best position to do well at a future race, and then how do you organize those in a way that's going to work out. And so far we haven't had a whole lot of issues. Some of that is because we both tend to really focus on the 100-mile distance as our peak races, so a lot of things line up really well there. She does skew a lot more towards trails and mountain type stuff as an interest, but she's also very good at kind of runnable trail. So yeah. And I mean, we live in Austin, so it probably favors my training stimulus is a little more. So for me, I'm maybe a little more spoiled in that I can usually get my fill pretty easily. And then if we need to leave for a month or so like that, in order for her to get the specificity, it's sort of my responsibility then to kind of account for that, since I've kind of got a little bit of an advantage kind of at the home base, more or less.
Yeah. Have you kept track of how many days gone you've been? Like I have some entrepreneur friends, and you do podcasting, you do all sorts of stuff. And at certain points, in your career where you get to that, like, oh, I'm now gone 150 days out of the year. Have you kept track of that?
I haven't. I don't think I've gotten to 150 though. I've had some years where I've traveled quite a bit, but actually, I may have traveled even a bit more when I was teaching, because I would have 3 months off essentially every year where I could just go wherever I wanted. And then I often would just get out of town for quite a bit of that. Yeah, it's what I've done more so than just traveling over my career is just moved. So I spent the early stages of my ultra running career was in Wisconsin. And then when I got to a point where it's like, okay, I'm going to need to choose between teaching and training and coaching and that sort of stuff, I need to I have a little bit more flexibility with my schedule and where I'm at. So then I moved out to California in order to have better access to just a wide variety of different training environments. And then when Nicole and I got married, she was in Dallas at the time, and we were looking for a place to kind of find that would work for both of us. And Phoenix checked a ton of boxes at the time. So we moved to Phoenix, and then we were there so I was in California for 3 years. Phoenix ended up being for 4 years. And then now we've been in Austin it'll be 3 years in January. So I guess about 2.5 years at this point.
There you go.
Yeah. So it's kind of one of those things where I feel like as soon as I've gotten like real comfortable with an area, I've sort of moved. And I think that what will likely be the case now, though, is we're pretty committed to Austin as being kind of home base, which means that I think we'll probably travel a little bit more. I mean, Austin well. It's not ideal training weather unless you want really bad weather in the summer.
Yeah, and you want to work out in a sauna. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think what we'll probably do in the future is a lot more of what we're doing this next like kind of 3-4 weeks is kind of use that time of year as a one where, okay, let's go somewhere cool or fun or somewhere that kind of matches whatever we're training for a little more specifically, and spend some time away from home from that. But I also would say, with like just kind of how I kind of set things up from when I stepped away from teaching to now, is I have a lot more flexibility the past few years in terms of being like 100% remote. So now it's like I can come to Taos or Telluride or Leadville and essentially do everything I was doing in Austin without it being like this big, okay, now I got to dig myself out of a hole when I get back home. Yeah. Record podcasts on the road, can continue coaching. Pretty much most of my coaching clients are virtual. So that it's just about being organized enough that you don't get so attached to your home setup that you can't replicate it on the road, which to be honest did take a little bit of a transition for me. I got really comfortable with like, oh, I like the way my computer is set up here. I like the way this is set up. I like that, to the point where I'm like, okay, now I'm also comfortable with my road setup where, okay, now I can put this here, that there, and I can feel like I'm just as efficient. Because I do juggle quite a bit of stuff. So I think getting efficient is what allows me to do that. If I start getting inefficient, then things start to suffer and I'm not feeling like I'm able to, maximize what I'm trying to do within those areas.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the name of the game. I can't imagine. I see you've got your nice podcasting stuff with you. I was happy, when you asked us like, oh, are we recording on video? I was like, yes. And I was like, Oh crap! I know he's training in the mountains right now. I hope he
We're gonna
brought
get
his
an
stuff.
iPhone.
But yeah, and you have such a beautiful studio at Austin. I love going there and seeing that set up. It's a great situation.
Yeah.
I have a fun question for you. Is with the trend that's starting to happen of people going bigger and really creating these crazy stories of like running a whole mountain range, or you know what I'm talking about, like let's run across the Sahara Desert. Like, is
Yeah.
there any pull for you as an individual to kind of like at this stage in your career get to that next thought process of just doing something not from a competitive standpoint but an internal competitive standpoint that way?
Yeah, I think for sure. I've always kind of had my eye on things beyond 100 miles. And it's sort of been a bit of a learning experience in the sense that, like, the predictability of, like, the sport's growth and what was going to be required to, like, really maximize potential in any one area wasn't always laid out clearly, I guess. So I've sort of adjusted as I've gone along in terms of what I kind of want to do with things. And the way I kind of look at it right now is there's a much shorter timeline on what I can likely do effectively or at my maximum potential with ultra marathons that are like 100 miles or shorter. There's a little bit of a longer span in which I can still probably at a very high, if not as high a level as I could expect for myself for some of that longer multi-day type of stuff. So it is something I'm very interested in, but I'm also trying to make sure that I don't allow it to sort of take over to the degree where it limits the amount of potential I have with the shorter timeline stuff. But with that said, like I've actually planned and almost did a transcon where you run from
Mm,
San Francisco to New York, and I got injured like right before it. So that got canceled because of the injury. I guess it's just something about running 3,000 miles with a target of 6 weeks that you don't want to go into with an injury because you're probably going to acquire one if you're
right.
healthy going in.
Yeah.
So I canceled that and sort of recentered myself, I guess, and thought to myself, okay, if I'm going to do this at the capacity I want to, I probably have to go about it a different way than I did. And that's just taken a little bit of kind of thinking and planning. And then also just like getting to a point where I'm as confident as I was earlier in my career about just like my durability, because the injury that I had for before that attempt sort of kind of reoccurred. And then I had another one that was maybe loosely based on that. So I kind of had a stretch of about 2 years where I wasn't like injured for the entire time, but I was also like lacking the tools to get to
Yep.
where I could typically do. Um, and it's like anything, like with training, like if there's advice I usually like to give to people who are have long-term goals within running, it's like it's really easy to get aggressive early and get excited. But if you want to really kind of maximize your potential, being patient and staying injury free is one of the best things you can do, because it really is a game of training load, not over the course of days, weeks, months, or even training blocks, but years, training cycles. So if you can be injury free for a couple of years or a few years, the amount of training load you acquire versus like having these like kind of hero training blocks that result in more injuries, you could look back at like a few years and realize, oh, I didn't actually do as much as I could have done had I just been a little more conservative around some of those, and kind of learning what inputs kind of keep you healthy and things like that. So
Yeah.
I, I'm at like, I think 14 months now where I've been like totally injury free and felt really confident in kind of where my body's been at. So I'm starting to kind of get to that point now where I'm looking at, all right, maybe there are some multi-day type of races or events that I could do, or projects, because there's these things in ultra running called FKTs, or fastest known times, where it's not an event, but it's a route that's been established and people have done it and documented it, and you can kind of see where you fall along the history of that
Is
particular
there a
route.
website for that people can go check that out? Because that's I actually
Yeah.
didn't know about that.
Yeah, you should check it out. It's really cool. It's called fastestknowntimes.com.
Okay.
And they kind of are the record keepers, and it's sort of like the ultra running Guinness Book of World Records, specifically for fastest known times, where they sort of like they get all the they have all the setups and stuff in terms of what you should do to document it, and then they record it and and then put it up on the website essentially after it's done and stuff like that. So that's the spot to look at the
Nice.
different ones that you maybe would want to get interested in. But and it's interesting. I mean, there's ones that are like heavily tested. There's like the rim to rim to rim Grand Canyon one is one where a lot of ultra runners, a lot of top ultra runners over the years have really gotten interested into that one. So that one's been stressed down quite a bit. But there's some on there where it's just like, oh, this is a really cool route, but there's just not a lot of documented efforts on it. And, it's still like pretty achievable for a lot of people. And I think as the sport grows, we'll start seeing a lot of that side of things get more popular. And then also you'll find more cool routes that were just a little less known than like the Grand Canyon.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's go to Patagonia someday.
Yeah. There's some routes there for sure.
Yeah, I'm sure there has to be. Yeah, imagine the end of your route is you hop on the boat to go to Antarctica and you finish a loop in Antarctica and go back to Patagonia.
Yeah, I mean, there's some crazy routes out there. I actually had a guy on my podcast. He's been on there a couple times now, Akshay, and he has a book called Fearvana, which is really cool. It's been like endorsed by the Dalai Lama. And it's just like this. He's this guy. What you'd call him an Arctic explorer, I guess. Or he's just totally invested and interested and passionate about Arctic travel. So he's going to do this this project where he's going to go from one side of there's like I guess there's maybe a little bit of debate within the community about like kind of what constitutes a full traverse of Antarctica, but really nobody has technically done ice shelf to ice shelf. People have done landmass to landmass or have done it in different ways where it's like, oh, they had like a kite, which is essentially like a parachute that kind of you can use as a wind sail more or less, versus 100% man powered where you essentially pull a couple of sleds that weigh 400 pounds when you start. So you got to you literally have to go in overweight just so you have like a reserve on you. And then, that 400 pound sled, 2 sleds in Akshay's case, starts dwindling down as he gets further and further, and so does he. So it's one of those things where he's getting more tired, but he's also getting lighter, and his load's getting lighter too. So, but it's just a fascinating like story. Like when he was telling me about it on the podcast, I was just thinking, this is one of those things where the logistics is so insane. There's a certain point where you have to just be like, okay, I'm prepared enough that I just need to like go and do it, and know that there's going to be something that happens that I have to adjust because there's just no way I can account for everything that's going to happen. But also do a good enough job of turning over as many stones as you can so that you don't find yourself getting airlifted out of the Arctic and hemorrhaging the probably I think his budget was something in the I think I could be wrong about this, but I think it was like $750,000 or something like that to make it happen. And like a third of that was just flights because it's like he's not hopping on United with a group of people. It's like they have to actually fly him by himself. And then on top of it, like the project itself is going to take, if it works, it's going to take 110 days. So like they have like a science lab out there, but it's not open for 110 days a year. So he's got to pay to have these people stay out there like a couple weeks longer than they normally would, and then essentially charter a flight out of there once he's done. So it's just insane. And that's probably I would say
crazy.
That's probably the extreme of the sport at this point. I can't think of anything that I would consider like more daunting and more logistically challenging than that. But there's a lot of crazy stuff like that out there.
Yeah, that's the early explorer days. That's for sure. That's like really doing
no doubt.
Is he going to have like a snow sled accompany him, or is he solo?
Yeah, so his big project and goal is to, 1, be the first person to ever go ice shelf to ice shelf, and then 2, be ice shelf to ice shelf completely powered by him. So no propulsion system that would help him move anything other than his own locomotion. So he's got to pull the sled himself. He can't have any sails or anything that would kind of catch a wind breeze or anything like that. Nothing motorized or self.
Yeah. But is he having support or anything like that?
No, he's out there all by himself. So he'll start off. He does have he will have communication. I can't remember exactly what the setup was like, but he will be able to communicate periodically with the laboratory that's out there. So they will have kind of eyes and ears on him more or less. and he does have an out if things would get bad. But after hearing how he described it, I
Got
mean,
it.
it would have to get. I mean, here's an example of how bad it will get before he pulls the trigger. He's actually missing the top part of, I think, two of his fingers because on a previous expedition he got such bad frostbite they had to remove it. So it's like he's that invested in it where it's like he's given up digits in order to make these things happen in the past. So I don't suspect he's gonna
Yeah.
pull the ripcord anytime soon if things get difficult out there. So wish him luck.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly. It's when you watch the Alone show,
Yeah.
are you familiar with that where they, the competition where they go out there and they pull them so quickly, like I mean, those people could handle way more than
Yeah.
what they actually like allow in the show from a frostbite standpoint. It's
Hmm.
kind of interesting, but anyways, that's really fun. Man, I probably could just
Yeah.
talk about that stuff all day, but we should probably talk about some other
Yeah, this could
stuff.
be an endless podcast episode.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. No, no, we'll probably be doing this again anyways. But at any rate, yeah. So food, nutrition. I know lots of people ask you about this type of stuff. I don't want to spend too much time on it. But for you personally, what has been your journey into where you're at now? More important than like, we don't need to talk about low carb and keto and all that kind of fun stuff, but what was your deciding factor that made you go down the path that you actually wanted
Yeah,
to?
I think it was sort of like multifaceted in the sense that I felt like I had some opportunities for improvement around just the recovery side and the nutrition side of things. And it was just, again, like I guess if there was a theme with my ultra running career is like timing has been just really on my side where I mean, ketogenic diets and low carbohydrate diets have been around for a while, but it kind of comes in waves when there's like more interest in a specific area or some researcher is able to get funding and they do a new battery of tests and things like that get open up another layer of information that we were either questioning or unsure about. So Dr. Finney and Dr. Volek were very much kind of like really picking up a lot of momentum with some of their work around the same time I was getting into ultra running. So I gave it a shot in, I think it was the end of 2011. I switched to a pretty strict ketogenic diet for a while during an off season, and then sort of like ramped up training alongside that eventually, and then realized, there's maybe a little bit more nuance here than just a strict ketogenic diet. So started playing around with like a little bit more of a low carb, kind of more of a periodized approach in terms of what my carb inputs look like around different training cycles or training blocks within my training cycle, and spent probably about a year and a half or 2 years just kind of really kind of figuring out how that would work for me and my race goals. And I mean, it's just worked so well that I was like, all right, this is what I'm going to do. And unless I find a reason to pivot from it, then that's it. And then
Yeah.
since I've been doing it for so long now, it's been like kind of the pivot I made, I guess, from that first year and a half to 2 years after just really learning how to kind of input the macros was just like, what different inputs can I plug into that? And over the following 11 years, I've done a pretty wide variety of different inputs there, from like mostly plant-based to mostly animal product-based to everything in between. So that's kind of where my curiosities are now, kind of there. Or I guess
Yeah.
maybe that's what keeps it sustainable for me or interesting to me is like, I know like if I get a little repetitive with specific inputs through a training cycle, at the next one I can say, oh, maybe I'll keep the macronutrients the same, but maybe I'll try like this different set of foods here and see how I respond to that. And you really learn a lot about
Yeah.
yourself and what your preferences are.
You really do, and I really want to stress that a lot for a lot of people because that everyone tries to think that there's this right or
The silver
wrong one
bullet.
solution for the rest of their life kind of thing. Yeah, the silver bullet. Did you track your macros for a little while, or did you just kind of ballpark guess like, oh, I know 4 eggs are about this, and I know about a 12-ounce steak is about this, or did you actually macro calculate
Yeah.
back in
Yeah.
the
So when I
days?
first got started, I tracked pretty meticulously because I was to some degree really learning. I was aware of just like tracking and things like that. And I had a pretty good grasp of like what different foods had in them. Even because I got interested in nutrition before I did low carb, I was just kind of following the more standard endurance protocols of moderate to high carbohydrate. And then when I switched, it was kind of more about just like kind of expanding that catalog towards foods that I wasn't eating nearly as much of or at all before that, and kind of learning where their inputs did. So I did a lot more strict tracking then. And then what I would end up doing is like, for me, I like variety, but I like variety over a very long stretch of time versus variety within, say, a training, like a 16 or 20 or 24-week training block for a specific race. So a lot of times what I'll end up doing is when I'm in my off season and I'm kind of setting up what I want to do to prepare for my next goal race, is I'll start looking at what type of food inputs I want to play around with. And I'll get a lot more strict about tracking because then it's a little bit more new and I want to actually see what the numbers fall into. And then since it's a little bit more new, I'm a lot less like probably accurate with like eyeballing things. So I'll track a little more strictly for a while. But eventually I get to the point where I just know like, all right, before my run, I eat this. After my runs, I eat that. And then I have like that kind of working system in place. And it is a little bit more intuitive and plug and play at that point versus feeling like I have to be sitting there tracking everything I eat. Because within that one particular training cycle, the inputs are consistent enough that I'm not necessarily changing enough to the degree where I feel like I have to like, oh, this is a new thing. Now I have to track that. Or so I get a little bit of relief at a certain point once I've learned it.
Do you add in extra layers of data like subjective symptoms where, so like you're keeping track of your macros and then keeping track of your periodization of your exercise, but are you keeping track of like your symptoms of how you feel, recovery, like thought process, like, oh, this is, and try to match up those three layers? Are you trying to do that at all? Or are you just kind of going, I'm just doing this and adjusting the plan?
Yeah, I would say my first layer is just plugging it through an app that will give me like the data on what the macronutrients are and the micronutrients. So when I set something up, I'll take like a first pass at what I think I want, and then I'll plug that in. And if there's a big hole there where, say, for example, I find, oh, it looks like with this setup, I'm getting 50% of my RDAs with magnesium, I should maybe figure out what I want to do to kind of remedy that. And I'll fine tune it to get it so I'm kind of landing in what on paper would look like it was nutritionally complete, both macronutrient, energy intake, total, and micronutrient side of things. And then from there, I will do that, and I will get like blood tests and things periodically over the course of the year just to make sure that I'm not missing. Because I mean, there is differences in bioavailability for some. I guess the biggest risk I play with switching those inputs is I may have something where the RDA is 100% with one input, but I might just be like really good at absorbing nutrients from that, and then I switch it to something else where my body is maybe at an individual level or to some degree a population level just worse at absorbing that from a bioavailability standpoint, and then I find myself in a situation. But I think that's usually remedied from getting some blood panels occasionally and kind of seeing where things are at, making sure things aren't like teetering the wrong way. If they are, look for like, okay, well, what do I do to kind of ramp that up a little bit compared to what I am doing now, and watching for that. So that's kind of my standard protocol with it. In terms of kind of what I'm assessing a little more subjectively, although some of this is getting more objective with like sleep tracking and things like that, sleep quality scores and all that. But I am looking at that too. I'm thinking that my big one a lot of times is just like digestion. So like, I'm training a lot, multiple times a day often. So it's like if I have a pattern of eating that has me feeling like, oh, I just feel like too full or just like unsatisfied, then it's like this isn't going to be consistently sustainable. So I should change it before I get to a point where I'm just like diverting from it randomly because I want to avoid something that isn't optimal, like feeling like I'm too full for a training run or feeling like I'm hungry all the time and things like that. So so I pay attention to kind of how my digestion is feeling and how I'm feeling in workouts relative to that. And one of the reasons I focus on that is because digestion is just a huge component of the racing that I do. Since I'm racing these long events, you want to be able to be fairly predictable in terms of kind of how your body's going to respond to different foods and things like that, and have that work out well for you versus unpredictable there. So I pay a lot of attention to that. I pay a lot of attention to sleep. So like, how are these food inputs affecting my ability to fall asleep at the time I want to fall asleep. Like, am I noticing any sort of like disruption in sleeping patterns over the course of the night and things like that? I can do those somewhat subjective and objective. I can watch like sleep tracking things like HRV. I actually like resting heart rate probably a little bit better um, from a consistency standpoint, uh, in terms of just kind of like how my body's recovering from training sessions and things like that. Uh, and yeah, and I mean, if it's something where it's like I'm eating specific things for dinner and I notice, oh, I'm waking up 3 times a night versus eating a different way, I'm sleeping straight through the night. Um, I pay attention to that stuff for sure. And I'm always trying to get to the point where I'm basically sleeping through the night. And I have enough data on just kind of what my needs are for the most part. I tend to be the most productive and the most energetic and the quickest recovery when I'm averaging between 8 to 8.5 hours a night. Doesn't have to beat that every night, but if it's something where I have a couple nights in a row where I'm closer to 7, I'll need a night where I sleep 9 or 10, and then as long as I have like maybe like a 3 day rolling average that gets me to around like 8.5, 8.5, I usually tend to be doing quite well. So if I start seeing that not play out that way, that's when I start kind of, that's like the first red flag is like, okay, what am I doing that could potentially be impacting sleep negatively and likely down the road potentially impacting recovery at that in that respect. So if it's something where it's like, oh, I just changed my dietary input and now I notice that disruption in sleep, it's never completely clear, but it's usually like I try to look at what are the things I changed the most, or I try to not line up multiple changes at once if I can. I try to kind of keep major dietary changes like the inputs a little bit more like around off-season time. So I get the stress testing of those done in an off-season where my training load is a lot lower, and kind of dial that in over the course of that before I start ramping things back up again, so that I'm just making smaller adjustments by the time training is ramping up. And yeah, that's versus I guess saying like throwing a whole wrench in the situation like midway through a training block and then having to try to figure out like what is actually impacting it. Was it the fact that I started doing speed work, or is it the fact that I switched that dietary thing? I try to kind of keep it consistent with that, where I don't do big dietary shifts outside of the off season for the most part.
Got it. And have you noticed a correlation of timing of food as well, since you seem to be very in tune? Not many people talk about this, and that's why I'm asking. I'm curious your experience. 7 o'clock seems to be the magic number when I'm working with my patients of if they eat after 7 o'clock, there's massive sleep disruption in a good percentage of the population. With your training schedule and everything like that, I have to imagine that there's been some times where you eat late at night. What does that look like for you?
Yeah, I'll generally try to kind of eat maybe my main dinner meal like a couple hours before I go to bed. That usually works well for me. Usually what I find is if I start pushing that back, say like I'm trying to get to bed at 9 o'clock and I'm consistently finishing dinner at 7, but then one night I'll like get busy or something like that and eat dinner at 8:30. What I notice then is my body sort of just shifts. So then it's like I just don't fall asleep at 9 o'clock. I fall asleep at 10:30. And then it's like and the problem I find with that for me anyway is that doesn't necessarily result in me just sleeping an extra hour and a half that next morning. It oftentimes I'll if it gets to be like an hour and a half plus later than I normally will, I'll usually sleep a little later if have a setup where I don't have to set an alarm clock, but it's rarely as much. So it's like if I go to bed an hour and a half later, I might sleep in a little bit more, but it's maybe like 45 minutes. So then I kind of get myself in that situation. If I'm doing that consistently, I end up sleeping 7.5 hours. And I get to that point where then I just start noticing kind of the fatigue in training or the dip in motivation and, things starting to like not work quite as well as I found them to in the past. So I'll try to get back on track as best I can.
Got it. When you're working with people, I mean, obviously you've had a lifelong, or not a lifelong, but a very long time of being very dedicated to your habits. When you're working with people, what's the biggest tip to helping them think of these types of things and being consistent with it, because everyone has the culture of Thursday night go
Yeah.
out, Friday night go out, Saturday night go out kind of mentality of the different things. When you're working with people, what's the
Yeah,
big
I think
tips?
like I think starting off right tends to be like one of the bigger ones because if you don't start off right, there's going to be problems that come up eventually and they're going to be harder to solve once you're further down the road. So, one thing I like to do for people is two things. One is let's not change anything for a few days and just track what it is because most people aren't very like they just a lot of people just haven't. They'll come for me anyway, they'll come to me and they'll be like, "Oh, I've been doing just like kind of my normal nutrition that they've gotten accustomed to and I'm curious about doing a low carb approach. How do I change that?" And I'm like, "Well, first let's just make sure we have the data on what you have been doing because we know what results you've been getting. You know what you feel like, we know what results you've put up, we know how you feel. We can roughly kind of document that. And if we can match that up to what you're currently doing, then we can decide what to do from there versus not knowing how big of an overhaul we're even doing. So usually we'll do something like we'll track what they're eating for 2 or 3 days, get that baseline info, and then look at those numbers and say, okay, let's see what we want to adjust here, if anything. And the other thing I like to do is let's look at how this is going to play out in the long term versus how you're going to do in the first 7 to 10 days when you're like super motivated, kind of like New Year's resolution type stuff. And look at like, if it's something
Yeah.
where it's like, hey, I'm going to be going out on Friday nights and it's going to be a scenario where these things are going to happen and I'm not really sure I'm going to be consistently able to avoid that. We just put that in the category of the non-negotiables. So I do this with training too, where people I think get hung up a lot of times on like what is the best training plan on paper or what is the best nutrition plan on paper. And none of that really matters if it's not sustainable within the other areas of your life that are also important to you. So first we just kind of go through like what are some non-negotiables with like terms of things you're going to do outside of training or outside of nutrition. And once we kind of have those established, we have a little bit better of an outlook of what's available. And then we build a plan around that. And that's at least a good starting point because maybe down the road they decide, oh, I am willing to sacrifice that, or I'm no longer interested in that. That gives me an opportunity to maybe get a little bit better at something else, whether it's a different training modal that wasn't available to us before because of time restraints, or we can address their nutrition a little bit more because they're no longer in an environment that's going to put them in a spot that's leading them a different direction and kind of layer it on over time versus feeling like they're just overhauling everything in their life. And then, it's one of those things where you overhaul everything and do well at 9 out of the 10 things you changed. You're going to fixate on that one thing that you didn't do right versus the net gain that you probably had. And then that sometimes that leads people to just kind of dispatching the entire process and going back to what they were before versus thinking about how much growth they actually made. So I really do think a lot of it is about first establishing a baseline of what they've been currently doing because we know what results they've gotten from that. And then from there, planning something that is going to be sustainable in the short term and presumably the long term. And if there's more that can be done later, we'll cross that bridge then once they've gotten consistent with the stuff that we know that they can maintain.
Got it. Very cool. Well, any other parting words of wisdom for people that are interested in, changing their habits, so to speak?
Yeah, dude. Schedule the Transcon and see if you can run. No, I would say like
Yeah.
that's all
right.
Yeah,
Let's go to Antarctica.
I would say this. I would think like is what oftentimes draws people into. I don't think this is unique to ultramarathon. I think this is just like the human mind. I think we see this oftentimes where people decide for one reason or the other. A friend they see have success at something, or maybe they watch the Olympics and they realize, wow, that's so cool. I want to like get in shape, or I want to, change my dietary habits or things like that. And they have this like really cool, admirable long-term goal. And they're like hyper motivated by that. And that's great. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Where people oftentimes go off, or where I usually tell people the next step to that is, okay, you have that goal, but that goal is not going to necessarily stay as motivating as it is today. So the next step is scaffolding out what it looks like to get there so that you can start building in progress monitoring successes along the way. This is like with training too, where like maybe someone decides they want to go from the couch to 100 miles. And if you, that's a great goal. It's an awesome goal. It's a fun goal. It's a motivating goal. But if there aren't other things that you can measure along the way that will show like, oh, you know what? Over this last 4 months, I've run X number of miles and my pace at this intensity is now here where it was there. Or now I'm able to do a little bit more variety in my training. I can now do a strength routine. I can do a speed work session. Like all these different things that are like really authentic, great wins that if you're consistent with over the long term are going to continue to feed into your progress. Being able to kind of like see those as the victories that they are and kind of reward yourself internally with that kind of like, I did it. That's cool. I saw the progress. That's what's going to keep the long-term goal motivating. So I like kind of looking at that through like, are there wins you can use as a daily motivator? Are there wins you can use as a weekly motivator? Are there wins you can use as a monthly motivator? And then a training cycle motivator and things like that so that you have all these like short and long-term things that are kind of keeping you excited, keeping you accountable, and making it a reality so that when you do get to the end of it all, I think we probably talked about this on one of the podcasts you were on with me where it's like, ideally you get to a point where when you're standing on the starting line, you're like, hey, I could just totally screw this thing up and have the worst experience of my life and drop out of this thing, but I'm still going to be really excited that I did this project because so many other things in my life improved because of it. And now I have way more tools than I had a year ago. And that's the real big win.
Yeah. And I, I'm personally attesting to this as you are my coach, as those eyeballs. Like for me, I've done so many different sporting events in my life, but I realized, certain things of like I needed eyeballs on me to give me that satisfaction that I was moving forward. And so just the simple fact of having you as my coach, like it's not been the number of miles per week. It hasn't been anything around that that's been motivating for me. It's weird. I don't even have a question about it. Like I'm just doing, even with my bum knee, even with my bum back, like crazy things that have been happening to me physically, like simply because your eyeballs, and I know I'm like made a promise to you and I made a promise to the world that like showing up is so much exponentially easier, but it took me a little while to figure out that from my own personal drive. So I appreciate you saying, the whittled down version of what you just said is focus on the progress, not the end goal. And I think us working together and those sorts of things have really made me understand that as this goal of me getting to my 100-miler, I am going to be happy. Of course, I would be bummed if I didn't finish the 100-miler, but yeah, I am happy with my progress. I'm happy with everything that this has done for me already. So I'm already grateful for that and having that appreciation. So yeah, so thank you, and maybe that's our next point is you coach people, and so let's share the wealth and share the information. Where is the best way for people to get a hold of you? I'm going to put all this stuff in the show notes, and people better be signing up with you to
yeah. I have everything kind of linked to my website at zachbitter.com. That's where you can find kind of the different coaching packages that I offer, social media handles, podcast links, and things like that. So that's the easiest spot to swing by if you want to see more.
Yeah, and you're super active on Instagram, so that's always a fun one as well.
Yeah.
And your podcast is amazing. If you want more conversations like this, that definitely people need to follow your podcast.
Yeah, check out Dave.
Thank you so much
check
for your
Dave
time. I look forward to. Yeah, right. Go check out my podcast on your podcast. That's super funny. Yeah, we'll probably be doing this again after my race and finishing this up, and we have some secret projects that we're working on together that you're going to be featured in as well. So yeah, this is all coming together. Stay tuned, everyone. Keep that download button going and keep downloading these episodes.
Awesome, Dave. Thanks so much for having me on.
All right, take care.